So, Oren, welcome. Thank you for
Thanks. Hi,
joining me.
Daniel. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, and thank you also for sharing this book, which I have been enjoying. Your Heart
Mm,
Was Made for This, which is a very big title when we read the subtitle. Practices for Meeting a World in Crisis with Courage, Integrity, and Love. And
mm.
I can't help but wonder, in the face of all of the chaos we see in the world around us, what's love got to do with it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's got everything to do with it. Um, I think you know from reading the book that I'm a new parent. I have a
Mm,
16-month-old, and one of the things that's been remarkable about being around a very young, small human being, is to see how dependent we are on love and also how innate it is as human creatures. You know,
mm,
this little being, just the joy, the wonder, but also the love, just this very deep longing to be close, to share affection, to be loved. So I think, I believe, and on some level know that uh, love is deeply interwoven into our being, our DNA. There's even been some work done on some of the sort of genetic and biological roots of love in our species,
mm,
given that human beings have evolved to literally depend on close, warm, loving connection with other humans. So, what's love got to do with it? You know, I think one way of understanding what we see all across the world and across our communities and societies, whether we're looking at the ecological crisis, economic insecurity and income disparity, political uncertainty and division, racism, oppression, all of these different manifestations of suffering and violence and oppression. These are all reflections of um, our heart being kind of dislocated or disconnected from love in different
mm.
ways. And, you know, one of the things that's been so eye-opening to me in my own practice and learning and study is how that a condition of being disconnected from love is influenced by so many different things, including, you know, the effects of history that are still present and alive with us today. So, as we look at how to meet all that we're living through, I think one of the most fundamental things we can do, individually and collectively, um, is to reclaim the need for love that we have as human beings, and find ways to allow love not as a sentimental feeling, not as something wishy-washy, but as an incredible, powerfully enduring force to inform all that we do and see our fundamental interconnectedness.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
mean, it was a slightly tongue-in-cheek and provocative question, I have to admit, but
Well,
it's
but it's a good one. Yeah.
in the face of all of that,
Mm,
is love like holding flowers up to the man with the machine gun? And I
yeah.
suppose that's where we have to probe a little bit deeper. And
Yeah.
the whole structure of the book is built to do that, really.
Yeah.
If your heart was made for this, the book is made for training the heart by the
Right.
way you sort of
Yeah.
present it in the introduction. So these
Right.
qualities that
Yeah.
constitute a depth of awareness and capacity for bringing some of
Hmm.
these deeper expressions forward. I
Yeah.
just wonder if you could say a little bit about the choice of the topics. There are 26, and the idea is
Mm,
almost that you could spend a couple of weeks on each one and have a year-long
hmm.
training course. And
That's right.
uh, I wondered if you'd actually thought about offering that yourself, first of all, and
I have, and I probably will. So it's January of 2024 as we're
Mhm.
having this conversation, and I'm planning on doing something next year in 2025. Needed some time to wrap up some other work and just focus on talking about the book and getting it
Mhm.
out there. So the idea is, you know, that next year I'll offer some kind of online training program in different modules, kind of keeping pace with the different parts of the book. But Yeah, to answer your question, how did I choose the different? So the book's structured around these 26 different positive qualities. So you can call them traits or capacities that we all have as human
Mm.
beings. Everything from courage and kindness to concentration, energy, ease, determination or resolve, rest, joy, play. So many of the qualities, in fact, the greater part of them, are drawn directly from Buddhism. So
Mm.
anyone who studies or practices the Buddhist path will recognize the seven factors of awakening, the four divine abodes or Brahma Viharas, the five spiritual powers, all of these different, pedagogical lists. So I
Mm.
looked at those, and many of them repeat. And so I drew some of the most essential ones into the book. And then I also considered, well, what, based on my own practice and just my own life and exploring being a human in this day and age, what are some of the things that I need and that I see others need that perhaps aren't stated so explicitly in the Buddhist lists, but that are there nonetheless in the
Mm.
teaching. And so that's how, there are a few qualities in the book, like rest, for example. You don't hear the Buddha talk about rest so much other than saying, I will be devoted to wakefulness until I attain enlightenment and, don't lie down and sleep kind of thing. But
That doesn't
rest is
sound very
actually really,
restful, yeah.
yeah, but rest is actually really important. And it's there when we look at the teachings within the sort of shamatha aspect of the practice, this calm abiding, this very restful way of being, or play. The Buddha was actually quite playful. If you read the early texts, you see he makes jokes, he pokes fun at people, and so humor and play. If you spend time with any kind of enlightened being, you'll see that they laugh a lot. There's a lot of
Yeah.
humor, and what's one of the signs of wisdom, that to be able to laugh at ourselves and at life. Devotion. Devotion is very present in most kinds of spiritual paths, but it doesn't show up explicitly in any of the lists, but it's there in the teachings. In fact, again, I don't know how many of your listeners are students of the Dharma, but in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is one of the core meditation texts in the insight
Mm.
meditation tradition and early Buddhist Theravada
And in
practice.
modern mindfulness in theory, but
Yeah, exactly. Well, modern mindfulness, thank you, is drawn pretty much directly from Satipatthana practice. John Kabat-Zinn was studying with Joseph Goldstein and Sharon and doing Burmese Satipatthana practice when he founded mindfulness-based stress reduction. And if you look at his MBSR program, it's basically a Satipatthana
Mhm.
curriculum. So there are three core qualities that keep getting repeated over and over and over again in that text: sati, sampajanya. Sorry, the order is atapi, sati, sampajanya. So sati is mindfulness. Sampajanya is wisdom, often translated as full understanding, full awareness, as clear comprehension. It's a sense of having a broader awareness and understanding of what's going on. And then atapi. Atapi means ardor, zeal, wholeheartedness, devotion, like really, really putting yourself in there. So the qualities are drawn from the lists and also these other aspects of our heart and our life that I see as so essential.
Mm. And I'm curious about the word heart in that context, because you
Mm,
mentioned several etymological ways in which heart
mm,
shows up in Western
mm.
traditions. The word
Right.
courage, for example, coming from the Latin for heart, core.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
I'm just curious also though about this word in Buddhist context, chitta, which I'm
Mm-hmm.
more from a Hindu, I suppose one could call it, yoga background, and yoga
Right.
texts talk about this word chitta, very much to do with the mind and mastery of the
Yeah.
mind. But
Right.
look it up in a Pali dictionary, and it says the heart. So the heart and the
Yeah.
mind very closely connected in this way. So training the mind is training the heart.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so in many, Asian religious and philosophical traditions, I would assume the yoga tradition as well, and you can speak to this more than I can because I haven't studied the yoga texts. The heart and the mind are not separate in the way that we think of them in Western philosophy. This
Hmm.
idea of the rational mind being distinct from the emotional heart and the passions and the mind and needing to tame the heart and so forth. Um, the heart and the mind are connected in one, and the seat of consciousness is here, right in the center of the chest, rather than here in the head. So this is, in the physical body, this is where the chitta is often, we experience the chitta, even though it's immaterial, it's not actually located anywhere. We experience that sense of our feelings, our responses, being affected by things. So the chitta is that aspect of awareness that feels, that knows, that responds to the world. This is very much the sense of being a person, and awareness is the what we call the chitta. And yeah, so the chitta plays a central role in the Buddhist path because it's the chitta that's liberated. When the Buddha talks about awakening or enlightenment, it's the chitta that's freed. So the chitta, this seat of awareness, of consciousness, is what becomes entangled and afflicted by confusion, ignorance, all of the sort of knotted patterns in awareness that snag on things where we resist and control and fight ourselves and others in life. And so it's the chitta that actually awakens. The rational mind is in the Pali canon is talked about in another way, mano vijnana, so mental consciousness, which is sort of has a complex relationship to the chitta that I struggle to to articulate. Um, but it's kind of like another channel of awareness. So we have like
Yeah.
the body awareness, we feel things in the body. We have the mental, linguistic awareness. So the mental awareness in Pali canon, the early Buddhist philosophy, is the sort of conceptual mind, and then the chitta, the is that feeling, sensing, knowing awareness, which is the fundamental sort of root of being. So your heart was made for this. There's a few different meanings to that, but I'll pause there and just toss it back to you to see, on chitta,
Yeah.
if you wanted to add anything on yoga or.
Well, really, I suppose the distinction that pops up for me, and it's oversimplifying massively, comes down to this distinction between the yogic traditions focus on there being some kind of permanent self, and that's
Mm,
what's located in the heart. The Atman in the earliest of the Upanishads that talk about yoga is in the heart,
yeah,
but the problem's in the head. And so, in a
right.
way, it's tune out of the mind and into this permanent presence that's there underneath everything, and
Mhm.
the liberation is attained. So it's obviously come from a similar, I guess, store of knowledge, but with a different philosophical framework. But it does, I
Yeah.
think, get in the way of practice sometimes, because practice is all about this, control of the body, control of the mind to liberate the self, rather than
Mm,
this, work on the heart. It's not something that's emphasized in quite the same way in yoga texts. The similar messages creep through, and the qualities that manifest, and the importance of ultimately compassion is
mhm.
there, but it's not got the same emphasis that the
Yeah.
Buddha's teachings have.
Yeah, and I think, one of the challenges, Daniel, that I find as a practitioner and as a teacher of these traditions is are the limits of language and
Mm,
the one dimensionality of texts. So even something like those phrases you used of like control the mind or control the body. So I think it's one of the reasons why it's so important to have a relationship with a teacher and to get guidance from someone who actually um, has some understanding and experience of what the teachings are pointing to, because
yeah.
that phrase, which shows up in the Buddhist tradition too, in the translations, anyone who's done a Goenka course, is a 12-day Vipassana trainings, knows, Goenka is very big on control your mind. But the word control has a lot of different meanings, a lot of different connotations. Most of the time, I think for Westerners, that word connotes a certain kind of rigidity, contraction,
Mm.
stress, and will. And those forces are antithetical to liberation. We're not trying to contract and be rigid. There's the sense of firmness and strength in the mind that we're cultivating are there to counter the overpowering momentum of our habits, these sankharas, in the service of letting go, of releasing the self-centered drive towards control. So I think we have to understand that process in a nuanced way and really have a felt sense for what it means. So yeah, I often find that in the actual practice, when we look at these different traditions, when we actually get to some experience of what they're pointing to, they're often very, very consistent and aligned. So
Mm.
the title has a few different aims behind it. There's obviously the sort of surface meaning. We kind of look around at the world today, and um, whichever facet of the challenge we might see, and it's always important for me to acknowledge all of the goodness and the beauty and the
Yeah.
amazing progress that continues to happen every day. It's so easy to have to only see the negative. Um, but when we do open our awareness to the suffering and the uncertainty and the difficulties we're facing, it's a very hopeful message. It's so easy to feel like I can't do it. We can't do
Mm.
it. Ship's going down. And to say, hey, as a friend and colleague of mine who has another book with a very similar title, Kyra Jewel Lingo, her title is "We Were Made for These Times,"
Yes.
which has the same message. Your heart was made for this. It's a very ancient message, actually, from indigenous elders. It says, "We are the ones we're waiting for," right?
Mm.
We were each born into this time for a reason. We each have a role to play. So there's that sense of really wanting to connect people with a sense of empowerment and hope and possibility. But then there's also the deeper meaning that I truly believe and have seen through my own practice and also, again, through raising a child, that our heart meaning, um, our conscious awareness, our this incredible um, sensitive instrument of a human mind and body that we've been gifted,
Mm.
has as its underlying blueprint the potential and even I would say like the instructions to realize this vast, beautiful, immense potential to flower in love and joy and compassion and goodness.
Mm.
That's what our heart was made for, to open, to awaken, to be the best we can be. And so my hopefully not grandiose hope with this book is to remind all of us of that and to provide some nourishment for that journey, to say, whether you're working two jobs, raising kids, or living in an ashram somewhere or anything in between, there are concrete practical things we can do every single day to realize that potential.
No, and I think there's something that comes through very clearly in the introduction that really underlines that. You quote from
Mm,
the Kusala Sutta about, the fact is that
mm,
if it wasn't possible, the Buddha wouldn't tell us to do it. And he's saying,
that's
look,
right.
it's there, it's your birthright.
Yeah.
But it doesn't just happen by accident. There is
Well
a
said.
path that some work has to be
Yeah.
done.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well said, friend.
So, having listed all of these qualities, I'm curious, which seems the most important to you, perhaps for yourself, but also for the world as a whole?
Oh. I can only speak to myself. I don't know what's most important for the world,
Mm.
because it's so complex.
Yeah.
But Yeah, I think what's most important just on that broader level is that we some of the things that seem most important. One is aspiration,
Mm,
because we need aspiration is the sense of possibility. It's vision. It's vision. It's the Declaration of Independence. It's I have a dream. It's si se puede. It's Che Guevara saying, blank, I'm not remembering the exact wording of the quote, but the impossible is realistic.
mm.
So
That's a
aspiration is another world is possible, right? All these slogans, the World Social Forum, the United Farmers Workers Union, it's the sense that we can use our time and energy and relationships to craft a better world for ourselves, other creatures, and future beings. And without that, we just languish, we sink in despair, we give up. So we need a sense of possibility. We need a sense of vision for where we're going. And I think that's really, really essential.
mm,
Because without that, we don't bring forth energy, we don't try, we don't learn. That's one of the things I think that's most important, and that is hard to come by today because so many of the problems are so overwhelming, and so much of the media does not report on so much of the mainstream media does not report on all of the tremendous work that's being done.
mhm,
So, more and more the kind of emotional response, particularly to the climate crisis, the kind of anxiety and the despair. Um, we need something to counter that. And one aspect of addressing those emotions is through meaning and having a sense of possibility. So that's one of the most important ones. I think the other thing that I would say, just on this broader collective level, Daniel, is
mm.
um, just the fundamental understanding that we can change and grow, right? That all of us have innately the capacity to learn, to grow, and to be happier. that
Yeah.
that I mean, depression is so debilitating and challenging sometimes. Um, we lose sight of that knowledge, really, that our brains, to come back to like a neuroscience metaphor, are plastic. They're
Mm,
malleable, and we can shape them. We can play an active role in how we experience the world instead of being a passive victim to our conditions. So I think those are two very important things for the moment we're in historically. As far as myself, some of the things. So one of the things that's different for me about this book from my first book was on communication, Say What You
mm,
Mean, is that this content, I've been talking about it as an emergent content, which means like I'm practicing with this stuff every day.
yeah.
It's hard. It's not easy, as as a husband, as a father, as a facilitator and teacher, as a citizen. And so again, that the I'd say the one most fundamental thing that's important is the same that I said, of just knowing that we can make a difference internally and externally. And then it's really a daily thing, So I'll share um, of my little altar over there. You can't see it behind the
Mhm.
shoji screen here, and Buddha Rupa, some pictures of my teachers, a photo of my late father. And I just put it out a few days ago, a couple of photos of myself as a child. And one of the things I'm just working on is um, a certain intimacy and tenderness for my own vulnerability. And this has been, I don't know, decades of of work, but it's I find the spiritual path is a little bit like a spiral.
Yeah.
And
My
it
favorite
seems like there's
metaphor
like,
from, sorry, go ahead. I
yeah,
say my
no,
favorite
please.
metaphor from Hesse's Siddhartha, like this part of the spiral, around and around we go.
Yeah, yeah. But it's not a two-dimensional spiral, it's a three-dimensional
Mm,
spiral, right? And we go around and we're like this again, but actually it's at a different level.
yeah.
And so, I talk about in the book some of my own trials with my vulnerability and self-care. And, right now, um, I feel a different level of responsibility than I've ever known before in my life, particularly as a dad, and also having lost my own father just a few months before the book came out. Um, and so, there's this little boy inside still who's scared. It's like, it's too much. I can't do it. Help. And so what am I practicing? I'm practicing mindfulness. I'm practicing a certain kind of self-compassion, and practicing ease is a big one. A lot of my conditioning and my tendency is to shoulder the responsibility and push through. And it's not only is it not necessary, but it's harmful to myself. And then I'm less resilient and available for the ones I love and for the work that I'm doing in the world. So it's a kind of on a daily basis, really, just listening for what's needed. But those are some of the qualities that I see being really relevant for me. And I can add, um, courage has been a big one, um, particularly since October 7th, as American Jew, as somebody who's in a position of some, um I don't know, religious or spiritual leadership. Um, really having the courage to look at the history of the Middle East with a critical lens, to not fall into simplistic sound bites the way we see happening around the world, and to both hold the complexity of the history alongside my own values and integrity. Um, it took a lot of courage. So yeah, different qualities at different times needed.
All right, there's a lot there. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to go back to the very beginning of your story, if you don't mind, because when you say about this
Mm-hmm.
challenge of,
Mm,
taking the pressure off your shoulders, it reminds me of the story you tell about how you first
mm,
came to practice meditation as a young
sure.
man at college, pushing, pushing, pushing,
Yeah,
and seemingly running away from yourself, and then suddenly
that's
winding
right.
up, in at the deep end in India, completely confronted by all the stuff you've been running away from. And I just wonder what it was you were so scared of at that time.
Thank you. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a beautiful and deep question. Um, what are we so scared of? I think sometimes we're just scared of being afraid.
Hmm.
One of the deep realizations I had on one long intensive retreat was it's not fear itself that's actually um, frightening. It's not feeling safe enough to feel the fear. That's really, really frightening. So, yeah, I should go back to the beginning of my own sort of spiritual journey. I share in the book that when I was a child, one of my family members started having a lot of challenges mentally and emotionally, and actually ended up spending a number of years in and out of mental hospitals. So it was a very chaotic time emotionally in my family, and as a child, very frightening time um, to see this person that I knew and loved, so changed, to see the stress on all of us in the family unit. And this was in the 80s, when the stigma around mental health was, I, of different order of magnitude than it even is today. There's still a stigma. And, then, so it was like, don't talk about this. And so there were a lot of emotions that I felt as a little boy that I didn't know how to deal with and couldn't process. And in spite of my parents, in fact, my mother's very prescient and astute um, impetus to send me to therapists and stuff, it just went underground.
Mm.
Something in me saw that this family needs me to be okay, like that, or believe that, like there ain't no room left for this little guy to need anything because everyone is just maxed out. So all of the fear and the anger and the grief went underground, and it didn't resurface again until I started practicing in my 20s. So I was running. So my coping strategy was just to keep busy. It was just like, great, like let's just focus on school. I started acting. I was, running around to auditions in New York City as a child actor, and I stayed really focused, and it was a very productive and useful coping mechanism, but one that continued to disconnect me from myself until I really started to try to slow down and reclaim what I had lost, the sense of openness and being carefree and wonder and just knowing my heart. And the practice opened that up, and then I did end up needing additional resources. The meditation was useful, but it was incomplete. And so yeah, I ended up getting involved with nonviolent communication and doing Peter Levine's somatic experiencing work for trauma healing, and all of those really helped me to come to terms with and integrate some of what had happened.
I'm curious
Yeah.
as to why you thought the meditation sort of wasn't enough. I think it would be very
Mm.
helpful to hear that because in lots of
Yeah.
different ways, practices are often incomplete, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of different.
mm,
Oh, it's kind of interesting squeaky noise. I think there's a lot of different reasons and conditions why something like a meditation practice might not be enough. And I think it depends on the individual and the context and the teacher and so forth. But what I can say for me was at the time in the 90s, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the insight meditation movement, which a tradition that I'm a part of, this sort of Western branch of the early Buddhist practice and teachings, um, was was less aware of trauma informed practice
mm,
the way we are today. And so the theory behind the practice, the overarching theory was one of just sit with it, kind of just keep being mindful. And when you're dealing with trauma, that's actually often counterproductive because you end up just looping.
mm,
And so there wasn't adequate support or guidance um, in in the in the actual sort of lineage of teachings themselves and how they were transmitted, and to a certain degree in many of the teachers I was practicing with. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that, and I think many people on a contemplative or spiritual path who were sincere about their longing not only for awakening, but also for um, a certain kind of wholeness as a human being, certain kind of integrated and thorough awakening, will find that there are certain, I'm looking for the right word here. certain, to use a more neutral word, certain patterns in consciousness that were established through relationship, certain unskillful and painful patterns. We could call them wounds, we could call them, whatever you want to call these forces that we experience as suffering. They were created through relationship, and they're often healed and resolved more readily through relationship. This is not unique wisdom to me. See you
No,
nodding.
but it's a good
So,
point.
yeah. So whether that context for healing and resolving and integrating relationally comes, say, through working with a therapist or a mental health professional, whether it comes through being in intimate relationship or friendship, or whether it comes through, relationship with another being like a pet or animal or the earth. Um, when that imprint in consciousness, that wound, that pain, that pattern happens through relationship, it's not that it's impossible to heal it on one's own through meditation. It's just harder, and it takes
Yeah.
longer, and it takes a lot more guidance. And so as I started to discover this, I was very fortunate to have some teachers who said, hey, you might want to check this out. This might help you. Yeah. So, I might backtrack a little and soften what I said before in terms of, like, I can't remember the word I used, if it was limited or incomplete, maybe. It's not
Incomplete
so
was
much
what
that
you
the
said, yeah.
practice is incomplete, but just less efficient in certain areas. It's like, why struggle with something for 10 years if you can take care of it in a year of therapy?
Mm.
Right? So, or by bringing in another modality. And I think this is both one of the it's a great gift and also a certain liability of the sort of modern spiritual landscape, is that we have the access and understanding and resources to bring in sort of the complementary modalities to our awakening journey. And then it's also a liability, because the danger, of course, as I'm sure you see in your own work, is that um, we can end up sort of, uh, you know, dabbling
Yeah.
in this and that, and not actually staying and going deep enough in any one practice, modality, or tradition to really reap some kind of profound results and transformation.
And even just mixing and matching in unhelpful ways that we think fit together nicely, but are actually
Mm,
just reinforcing unhelpful tendencies, and rather
totally.
than actually, yeah, working on them.
Right.
I'm curious in that context, just before we go on to talk a little bit about the nonviolent communication you alluded to, because I'm very curious to explore a little bit of how that shaped your own journey, as well as how it might
Mm,
sort of dovetail with some of the themes of this second book. I'd
mm,
just like to go back to your emphasis on aspiration and the
mm.
choice of that word in the context that you raised it, because it
Yeah.
seemed to be a way of actually translating a word that's normally translated differently. And
Yeah.
depending on Pali or Sanskrit, sada, shraddha, this word that's usually faith. And I
Mm-hmm.
wondered,
Mm-hmm.
why not faith there, and why not use aspiration in a different context in relation to a different quality?
Mm.
Is there
Yeah.
something about faith that's triggering, let's say, for readers, perhaps?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. Yeah. I think that word. So again, as we talked about before, I acknowledge we're dealing with translation and the limits of language here. So all of these terms that come out of the yogic traditions and Buddhist tradition um, are the words themselves in Pali or Sanskrit are translations of experiences.
Of course,
And
yeah.
then, so we're translating twice. We're translating from experience into a root language, and then we're translating from that root language into our native tongue, whether it's English or Spanish or another language. So, how do we get back to, as close as possible, the experience that's being pointed to? So, the word saddha, that is often translated as faith, which is, I would say, an accurate but incomplete translation, because saddha has many other meanings. Tanisaro Bhikkhu translates it as conviction
Yeah.
or confidence,
Confidence is a
which is
great translation, I think. Yeah.
yeah, which is pointing to another aspect of it. And aspiration is the way that Ajahn Sucitto, one of my main teachers, translates it, and I really like that. So yes, I find that many Westerners have um, a whole bunch of associations and connotations with faith, often that are not helpful, and that get in the way of hearing the meaning of this term and this aspect of ourselves and our relationship with our potential. So it comes across with these experiences we often have through our upbringing and whatever religion we were raised with, of blind faith, of disempowerment, of some kind of irrational sensibility. And so Saddha is that sense of faith. It's what Sharon Salzberg, who has a beautiful book called Faith, that I highly recommend for those who haven't read it, if you're interested to go more deeply into this quality of aspiration. She translates it in some ways as what you can place your heart upon.
Mm.
So another beautiful translation is trust. What do we really trust? So I talk in the chapter on aspiration about two aspects of the quality. So there is the receptive aspect of saddha, which is this aspect of trust, or what we might ordinarily associate with faith, which is a kind of surrender into something deeper, larger, that we can rely on.
Mm.
So in the Buddhist tradition, we talk about having faith in the Dharma, or in
Mhm.
the Triple Gem, in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. And it's a sense of what can you really place your heart upon with a sense of deep security and trust? What do you know to be true in the deepest way possible? Whether you can put words on that or not, and how do you sense that? And that is often it's an experience of opening, of relaxing, of resting into.
Mm.
The other side of it, the more active aspect of saddha, is the aspect of conviction, confidence, aspiration, possibility. It's that sense of I can do it. What am I pointing towards? The North Star. And I wanted to emphasize that more with the chapter, particularly at the beginning of the book, as an
Mm.
orienting principle for our lives, for our communities, and for our practice.
I hear you now, and I totally agree. We need orientation. It's something I'm often discussing with, especially yoga people who like to say there's nowhere to go and nothing to do. And actually,
Mm,
it's very important to have some sense of orientation. But I
yeah.
suppose just to be nitpicky for a moment, um,
Please.
I wonder if it's not though the quality that enables an aspiration to be followed through. It's the trust on which the first step on the path is taken.
Mm,
It is the
mm,
capacity to be able to bring forward an action that embodies the aspiration. So it seems
mhm,
to be a slightly different thing than the aspiration itself.
mm. Are you? I kind of thought I was following you for a moment, and then the meaning turns. So I'm not sure. Let me say what I'm hearing and tell me if I'm getting it. It's like,
Hmm.
are you saying that, is the actual first step less the ability to aspire and more the capacity to trust something?
It seems
Is
to
that?
be that way in the sense of the meaning of the term it is in the context that I'm familiar with it. And I
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
Yoga Sutra of Patanjali basically borrows the same idea as these five
Right. Right.
spiritual paths.
Oh, yeah.
Foundation
Yeah.
is faith on which
Right. Right.
one develops
Right.
vidya and so on and so
Yeah.
forth.
I hear you. I hear you. I think it's a really astute point, and it seems to me that it's not static or fixed, that it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg thing, and that it might occur differently for different people. So, for example, I know for me, just to speak personally, what drew me to the practice was I felt lost. I didn't know what I could trust, but there was some sense of longing, of
Mm.
wanting to be healthier, to be happier. And that was a kind of forward movement. It was a kind of aspiration. It was some sense of there's got to be a way out. There's got to be a way to get back to myself. And so that was that more active aspect of aspiration. And, even as I'm saying that, like, okay, we could say it, well, then within that, isn't there some sense of touching it and resting into it? So
Possible.
it seems like they're intimately tied together. And in my case, it was really more the experience of it consciously was more that sense of forward movement and looking towards something than having anything I could rely on or trust. And I see it in practitioners and students is that, some people come with some sense of a calling inside that they can rely on, and others come with a sense of seeking without even knowing what they're seeking.
No, it's a good point. I mean, I've written in
Yeah.
my own work about how, basically yoga is a system of practice, not of belief, but you still have to
Yeah.
have some faith that there's something worth trying. Otherwise, you'll never give it a
Yeah.
go. And so
Exactly.
it's a complicated mix. But yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for
Yeah.
indulging me there and also
Totally.
exhibiting some of what I wanted to talk about. There was a nice
Yeah.
NVC reflection of
Yeah.
just checking how, I had intended my words and whether your hearing of them accorded somehow with what it was I was hoping to communicate. And
Right. Right.
I wonder if you might say a little bit about how you came to be interested in nonviolent communication and perhaps even first of all, what it actually is.
Yeah, sure. So, nonviolent communications, as one trainer, Kit Miller, the former director of the Gandhi Institute, likes to say, it is an awareness discipline masquerading as a communication technique. So many people
Mm,
think of it just as a communication technique for having more effective conversations and deepening relationships and enhancing collaboration. But at its root, it's actually a practice of awareness and investigating consciousness and some, for many people, it even takes on a certain kind of tone of a spiritual practice.
mm,
So this is a very deep system of exploring what it is to be human. It was founded by a man named Dr. Marshall Rosenberg in the 80s, who was a psychologist, and found through his own research and work that when he focused his attention on these specific aspects of our experience as human beings, um, it was easier to stay connected to compassion. He found this in himself. He also found it in the research he did in people in many different walks of life and parts of the world who were, under extreme duress or experiencing violence, were able to refrain from dehumanizing others, even others who are actively harming them, and stay connected to some sense of shared humanity. So whether he was looking at the civil rights movement here in the United States and the capacity of the nonviolent struggle for Black liberation to not resort to violence, segments of the civil rights movement to actually embody a sense of shared humanity, or individuals and movements overseas, that one thing that was in common was the ability to be aware of our emotions and the underlying human needs that drive us.
mm,
So, nonviolent communication comes out of humanistic psychology and this basic premise that one of the things that makes us human is that we are all motivated in our lives and our actions, consciously or unconsciously, to fulfill certain underlying fundamental universal needs, these kind of core values that we have, these core motivating factors, everything from our physiological needs to more relational needs like belonging and dignity and connection and understanding and empathy, to what we might call higher needs or spiritual needs, meaning, purpose, beauty, transcendence.
mm.
And so I came across Dr. Rosenberg, his work, and this practice in my early 20s, as again, I was noticing a gap between the aspirations in my meditation practice and my capacity to realize those aspirations in my relationships with my coworkers and my family. So I espoused deep values for compassion and patience and peace, which I was able to experience to a certain degree in my meditation. But when I had a disagreement with somebody, or even just talked to one of my parents or family members, somehow all of the mindfulness and compassion would evaporate very quickly. And so I recognized the need for some training, some practice to bridge that gap. And I found in nonviolent communication a very robust and practical uh, way of training myself to embody and inhabit the values of the meditative path that I was on.
This maxim attributed to Ram Dass: if you think you're enlightened, go and spend a weekend with your parents, or some
Hmm.
such. And
Yes. Yeah.
I certainly recognize that.
Hmm.
I'd like to just drill down into one or two of the specifics, if you'd be willing.
Mm.
Your book, Say What You Mean. Very good title, by the way. I really, really liked that.
Oh,
As
thanks.
somebody who works with words and often finds himself using more words than he intended to, and not necessarily the right ones, it was a
Mm.
salutary reminder of the importance of just taking some time to tune in. And the
Mm.
third of the points, if I remember rightly, is to focus on what's important, focus on what matters.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so it's actually taking some time to really tune into oneself, which is where I think it comes back to some of the themes of this book. What are our values? What are our underlying needs that
Hmm.
we might
Hmm.
wish to pursue in accordance with these values, to be able to then stand a chance of expressing them in a way that's skillful, that will talk about us and what we
Yes.
need, rather than telling everybody else what's wrong with them and why they didn't provide it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If we want to say what we mean, we have to know first
so how do we
what's
get to
up, what we
know,
mean. And
given that
then
so
to
many
know, we have to listen very deeply. We have to, as you said, take time and really inquire. And often, because we're working with decades often of conditioning,
Hmm.
even when we listen deeply, it's sometimes quite confusing because we don't get a clear signal, because there are all these sort of distortions from society and how we've learned to be aware of our feelings and needs, or in many cases, learned to not be aware of them, actually learned to disconnect from them. So, one of the points I like to make, that is not mine, that I've heard my teachers and mentors in nonviolent communication make, is that none of us come into this world blaming other people. Is there's no baby that blames his mummy or daddy and says, bad mummy, I need milk. And it's just wow. I'm hungry, feed me, right? There's no sense of you're doing this wrong or you're bad. There's just this raw experience of the vulnerability of having an unmet need. Children, very young children, before they begin to learn the language, are unmediated embodiments of feelings and needs. Needs are met, baby's happy. Needs are not met, baby's unhappy. It's just very simple. And it's only through language that, and relationship and social conditioning, that we begin to become disconnected from our emotions and our needs, and learn to um, not only communicate with others, but actually, tragically, disconnect from this fundamental experience of our life energy. And this is what Dr. Rosenberg talked about, that the feelings and needs that we experience is an expression of our vitality, the prana we talk about in South Asian traditions. Um, that manifests in these different ways, these different movements of energy towards what I would characterize as wholeness. You know, Buddha said all beings want to be happy, and what that happiness feels like and looks like, you know, at the most fundamental level, of course, is a kind of unmediated liberation. But in the context of our lives, it often appears in these different relative facets of I want to be understood right now, or I long for some solitude or some connection or some meaning. And the process of knowing what matters, of focusing on what matters, entails relearning that inner language of experiencing our fundamental underlying needs as human beings. And that's a journey for many of us because it involves encountering all of the conditioning that has served to cover it up, the shame we feel, the obligation or resentment around being responsible for others or not feeling like our needs matter, or it's not okay to have needs or want something. All of those messages we've internalized that are distortions of of the truth, which is that life is an experience of depending on one another, like in very basic terms and in more sort of relational practical terms. And that there's no shame in that. It's quite beautiful. It's how we experience generosity and compassion and gratitude. There's all these beautiful, beautiful qualities that come to our aid as relational, interdependent beings. So this is the invitation of the practice: is to reclaim this aspect of being a part of life, being an
Mm.
interdependent part of life, and learning to experience joy and compassion and generosity and gratitude in that dance of being on the planet together.
I was going to add, dance. The metaphor you used there is very evocative of this play quality that you mentioned. You
Mm,
know, there's something
mm,
alive and it flows through us, and there's so much of a
yeah,
resistance to that in so many of the
yeah.
ways that we're conditioned. Yeah,
Yeah, and we find that in, come back to, I'm not sure, I think it's there in the Hindu traditions, this Leela, right? The play, and you
yeah,
see it in the Tibetan traditions, the Vajrayana traditions, the sort of the
yeah.
play of emptiness and the relative world is the movement of the awakened heart is compassion. It's the responsiveness to needs. And so the practices we've been talking about, the Buddhist practice and nonviolent communication, I find very consistent because it's trying to bring us back to this awareness and way of being where we get out of the way and are able to be aware of and respond to needs, including our own, but without that sense of self centeredness and attachment that demands that my needs are more important than yours, and without the sense of unhealthy self effacement and shame that says my needs don't matter and I'm only here to serve others, but actually being in healthy relationship with all of it.
Could we call such a way of being heartfulness, or would that be a little too cheesy?
Ah, I like it. Yeah. Heartfulness. Why not? Yeah.
Hmm. Well, thank you, Oren. Before we wind up, is there anything else in the book that you would like to emphasize? Anything we haven't touched on that it's important that people hear about?
Mm, thanks. I mean, we've covered so much. I really feel like we did a good job here. I'll just take a moment and see. Yeah, the only thing we haven't mentioned explicitly is this aspect of wise attention, right? So we've
Mm.
talked about, the possibility of transformation and have more or less pointed to the fact that we're always practicing something every day. We are training or shaping our hearts and our minds to behave and experience the world in certain ways. How do we start to shift that? We need to begin to pay attention with some discernment. We
Yeah.
actually have to get interested in how am I living? How am I thinking, perceiving, relating to myself and others in the world? And to start to learn how to change the channel, how to recognize the habits and patterns of heart mind that are detrimental to our own and others' well-being. And first, just be able to put our attention somewhere else more nourishing, not to avoid or pretend or ignore the difficult experiences or patterns, but just to begin to build a little bit more resilience and well-being inside, so that then from that place of being more grounded, more resourced, more whole inside, we can turn towards some of the patterns of fear, or anger, or reactivity, and heal them and integrate that energy into something more helpful. Yeah, so that's maybe the only thing I'd add.
No, thank you, thank you. And would it be a case then that we can, through focusing on these positive qualities, sort of almost actively unwind some of the detrimental qualities? For example, by cultivating generosity, selfishness also automatically kind of fades away a little bit. Or is it more that we also have to think actively about unwinding those things?
Yeah, well, I could share what my experience has been, and I'd be curious to hear yours
Hmm.
too. It's a little of both,
Hmm.
and that certainly, to use the example you offered, the cultivation of generosity does often um, unwind or dissolve a certain amount of self-centeredness, because we begin to experience the joy and the nourishment of giving. And yeah, I found it is often the case that there are layers of whatever the afflictive pattern is that also require their own kind of investigation and attention to really, for the heart to really know firsthand the suffering and learn to put it down. Yeah.
No, I would definitely echo that. I think for me, the biggest challenge has been, being brave enough to be with the pain and to actually
Mm,
allow it to be present without being consumed by it or trying to bury it. And that's an
mm.
ongoing work for me. I think, maybe with me for some time yet, but
Yeah,
I-
yeah,
hmm.
for sure.
Well, thank you again. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your generosity of spirit and of sharing some of the wisdom that's inspired the books that you've been writing. And look forward to seeing this course spring up. Hopefully, I'll send
Yeah,
a link to your website in the show notes for the podcast so people can follow up there and keep tabs on what's coming.
great. Thanks so much for having me, Daniel. Yeah, and if folks want to stay in touch, my email list is the best, which you can get to
Hmm.
from my website, is the best way. I send out a note every now and then with some news about what's happening or a little teaching or reflection. So thanks for the beautiful conversation, for hosting.
Well, likewise. No, thank you again.